very accomplished drummer, as you will see. And Val has the operatic voice of an angel. So without further ado, I turn it over to Steve Papatera.
Hello, everyone. We are at the Victor Recording Studio, just outside Camden, New Jersey, and a short bridge crossing from Philadelphia. Victor's historic legacy dates back to 1896 and the birth of the music industry, including the production of the first record player. Victor artists have included everyone from Elvis Presley and Cole Porter and George Gershwin to jazz greats like Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie. And they continue to record today's new and emerging artists. The song you're about to hear, Bewitched, Bothered, and Bewildered, is from the 1940 Rodgers and Hart musical, Hal Joey. The song was popularized and jazzed up by Ella Fitzgerald, and then put together into the film in 1957 and sung by Susan Hayward. And in that film, Frank Sinatra was also a member of the cast, and Frank Sinatra was also a Victor recording artist. Whether you're in a conference room or a classroom or courtroom, we are all competing for shelf space to gain and sustain attention in the marketplace of ideas, to get our message heard and to prevail with that message. The problem is, so many of us, most of us maybe, are just hit by so much information coming at us that we are bewitched, bothered, and bewildered by that torrent of information.
You're probably wondering, what does music and persuasion have in common? Good music follows some rules of composition. Good arguments follows rules of logic. They go hand in hand. You ever notice when people are listening to music and they don't understand the words, they still get into the music, they get into the beat, it drives them. It's something that drives them. They have to understand where you're coming from. Before you can persuade, you must also be able to connect. Music is about interaction. Persuasion is about interaction. It's often not the message itself, but it's how you deliver the message, the manner in which the message is taken. You receive different types of messages from music, such as pop, jazz. They all say different things to different people. There are many ways to communicate in a persuasion, in a negotiation, in a trial. The art of persuasion goes all the way back to Aristotle. We believe that there are three components of persuasion. One is logos, and that is that the idea must make sense from the audience's point of view. The other is ethos, which is reputation. What is your credibility as a speaker? What do you look and act professional? And do you have confidence? For example, a clear and strong voice. Would you feel differently? Would you be attracted differently if you're listening to somebody like Arturo Sandoval or Louis Armstrong, or a beginner trombonist, for example? Imagine a violinist at Carnegie Hall. The venue gives him credibility. Everyone's anxious for him to play. They want to hear him. They want him to be good, and he plays, he's fantastic. But put that same person with the same skill in a subway, and what's he going to say? No one's listening to me. People are just walking by. So keep in mind that it's important that the environment within the area that you're trying to argue and persuade is just as important. Connect, connect, connect. Pathos creates the emotional environment that they will listen to.
One, two, 3.
Lost my heart, but what of it? He is cold, I agree. He can laugh, but I love it, although the laughs on me. I sing to him, we spring to him, and long for the
going to give you a kind of formula during this program, a formula that you can use whether or not you are negotiating between adverse parties, whether you are speaking to an audience of 1 or 100, or simply communicating with your team. And we're going to use the acronym STIX. STIX is the acronym that will not only tie all this together, and we're going to analogize that acronym, which has crucial elements of persuasion, analogize that to jazz drumming.
You cannot deliver the message from the listener's point of view until you know what it is that you want. When a composer writes a song, he has a message. There's a structure to it. Composers and performers use music to tell stories and often convince others. Love songs are a good example. Somebody done somebody wrong song is to get a message. Once you know the story or your idea, then how do you convey that message? Remember that the other person's point of view, when you are telling the story, is what you need to focus on. You can tell someone, for example, you're wrong. You can tell them, I'm right. But if you tell them the story, you're going to be able to bring them into the discussion. And that's the structure. So remember, you have the message, how you're going to convey the message, and then you weave it into the story.
Principle number 2 then involves theatricality. You know, performance is important to persuasion, and you can enhance performance by adding theatricality. Think about when you go see a movie. How does it start? It starts with stirring images, evocative music. A mood is created. Maybe it's playful, maybe it's foreboding, but it captures the audience and brings them in. Or to paraphrase Renee Zellweger from one of my favorite movies, Jerry Maguire, with respect to an audience, you want to have them at hello. Another way to bring an audience in is to create what's called a curiosity gap. That is, immediately taking the difference between what an audience knows and what it would like to know, and then filling that gap. Let's go back to film again. Think about a murder mystery. People watch it because they want to know who did it. In a James Bond film, we all know that Bond is going to save the planet, but we are transfixed to see how he's going to do it. Even with the defense attorney, we've all seen these courtroom dramas where the defense attorney will say something like, I'm going to give you, the jury, information that will make any verdict impossible other than to acquit my client. A few years ago, I was asked to deliver a program called Life Insurance and Estate Planning to a cohort of people that were in a windowless classroom all week. So I'm thinking to myself, okay, I got to figure out a way to break their filter, which is another way to engage an audience. How do I change their state, give them some level of surprise? So what I did is I actually brought up 3 people from the audience to be background singers while I played hand drums and made up a rap song about life insurance and estate planning that went something like this. Well, I'm gonna do a song called the Life Insurance Rap. Oh, I tell you what you need to know, I'll tell you where it's at. And all of a sudden, like, people were pretty engaged. And as a result of that, I was able to keep their attention. So in other words, when you're doing performance, you need to be able to improvise and give yourself an opportunity to make the audience feel truly connected.
So it's important to be prepared. In fact, the better you know your subject, the easier it will be for you to improvise. So principle 3, improvisation. You may feel a bit intimidated by the term improvisation, But with both preparation and actually knowing the fundamentals of your subject, improvising is the most natural response to uncertainty and unexpected situations or responses. In other words, despite using the element of performance, we can never lose the moment and must be ready to improvise. So it starts with preparation, knowing your fundamentals that allows you to anticipate whatever is coming from outside stimuli. It also allows you to be conversational and not stiff like a robot. It also allows you for the element of surprise, like Steve just demonstrated, also called syncopation. And it allows you to have the ability to actually listen to what's going on, and therefore you can reciprocate. So you are no longer, in a sense, in a state of just going along with the flow or just plowing ahead, but actually going more along with the flow.
Jazz improvisation is a spontaneous invention of melodic solo lines or accompaniment parts. It's the one defining element of jazz. Improvisation is composing on the spot. You must, although don't confuse that with they're just making up stuff as they go along. Improvisation comes from years and years of preparation that somebody like Dizzy Gillespie or Bird Parker is able to just create this tune at the spot. It's the same with a negotiation. You expect unexpected things to happen. In a trial, unexpected things will happen. Notwithstanding, you need to be prepared. And always, always, preparation in the legal world will lead to very little surprises, but it will allow you to be adaptable because you can make the adjustment right on the spot. That's what I call legal improvising. Being creative with the facts you know, the law you know, being very, very well prepared.
Okay, we're going to demonstrate improvisation now by doing Duke Ellington's It Don't Mean a Thing If It Ain't Got That Swing. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing. Do I, 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 do I. It don't mean a thing, all you got to do is sing. Do I, 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 do I. Makes no difference if it's sweet or hot. You've got to give that rhythm everything you got. I mean nothing if it ain't got that swing. Do I, 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 do I. Don't read. It makes no difference if it's sweet or hot. You got to give that rhythm everything you got. I said it don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing. Do I, 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 do I.
If it ain't got that, if it don't mean a thing, if it, what is that?
Swing. It don't mean a thing, Steve, if it ain't got that swing.
I can never get that right. Inevitably, when you're trying to persuade, you want to use contrast. So just to go back and summarize, we had principle number 1, right, of our acronym structure. Principle number 2, theatricality. 3, improvisation. And now we come to the letter C, which is contrast. When you're trying to persuade, you want to make sure that you contrast between the state of what is and what could be. Now, one of the brilliant examples of this is Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech from 1963 on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. During that speech, King methodically laid out the problem of racial discrimination what had been and still was hampering the nation's promise. So he lays that out and distinguish between, look, here's what is, but then here's what could be. And what he does is he actually takes some suggestion from singer Mahalia Jackson, because he was kind of less than riveting at the beginning, kind of going through methodically about kind of what the state of the country had been and was. And then Mahalia Jackson says, tell him about the dream, Martin. And then King improvises brilliantly and gives us some of the most meaningful and unforgettable words in the American lexicon. If you think about when let's say you're in a presentation where you're trying to sell your firm's services, what you want to make sure you do is distinguish between, look, here's what you have, prospective client, and here's what you could have if you worked with us. So this idea of contrast, just to give you another musical example, I'm going to play something on the drums, a steady stream of single strokes, and then I'm going to improvise by just putting some accents in it. One of the things that I find, and we've all sat through these presentations that are oftentimes really boring, where someone just talks to an seemingly endless supply of bullets on a PowerPoint slide. We think that it's so important to just show up at full measure by adding accents and just putting a little extra color to it. So here are a steady stream of strokes. Just listen to it. Now I'm going to play the same strokes, but now I'm going to add accents, and just listen how different it is. And if I want to add more flourishing to it, I can jazz it up a little bit. And you get an idea of just how different that is. So now Val and I and the band, we had enough of this swing stuff. We're going to do a little funky stuff. We're going to show you how you can modulate between different instruments and feel and different sound to, again, put some interest in the presentation. You can do this in any number of ways when you're presenting. You don't have to be a musician. You just have to show up as yourself. So here we go. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. That's a high five, Val.
Yeah.
That's a very high five. Let's move to the fifth principle in our STICK acronym, being concrete. When you place a metaphor at the beginning of your argument, it acts as a lens. It helps the other focus on the idea to make new connections. The audience links the rest of your arguments back to the metaphor, and it makes a lot easier for them to understand the argument. This makes the argument more persuasive.
Okay, so I'm going to give you a real life example here. Years ago, when movie popcorn was really unhealthy, there was an organization that tried to promote the notion that you really shouldn't eat this stuff because it was so terrible for you, really artery clogging stuff. So initially, they put out advertisements that said, look, if you eat this bucket of popcorn, what you're really doing is ingesting 37 grams of saturated fat. Now, saturated fat, 37 grams, is really bad, but no one actually had a reference point for what that actually meant. So they changed and positioned the message. And here's what they did. They said this: if you eat a bucket of movie popcorn, it is the equivalent of, ready?
I'm ready.
It's the equivalent of eating bacon and eggs for breakfast Yes, what? A Big Mac and fries for lunch and a steak dinner with all of the trimmings. I'll give you another example. By the way, that example worked. People really got that because it was tied to something they could understand. So another example might be, I'm still playing shortstop in hardball leagues, right? And if I wanted to express to someone that I'm seeing the ball really well, it looks big, I could say to them, look, when I'm ready here to swing, the ball looks really big. It looks like, I don't know, 28 centimeters. But because nobody knows what 28 centimeters really equates to, it doesn't land. But if instead I say, pitch looks like it's coming in like a big beach ball, it's a completely different reference point. People understand what that is. So now I'd like to talk to you just briefly, since we've gone through five actually with concrete. So we've done concrete. We now go to our final part of the acronym, and that is the acronym dealing with stories. So if you think about it, people have been telling stories and communicating for millennia, but it's woefully not found in so many presentations. So I'll give you an example. So I went to Catholic school for 12 years, and those 12 years, yeah, I had a lot of religion. But if someone asked me even today, as a practicing Christian, to name the 10 commandments, I would probably not be able to get them all. But I have no trouble remembering the stories of the prodigal son and the Good Samaritan. Stories connect in with people. Here's another example of how stories ties in with emotions, because emotions is so critical, and so often it is not found when people are communicating. There was a study done by Carnegie Mellon University a number of years ago, and they looked at people donating, and they found that, look, if you have a story about a real person or family that's struggling, let's say, to get drinkable water, they found that that was going to be much more moving and get people to donate more than if you gave statistics like there are 1 million people in Southern Africa who don't have drinkable water. What's really fascinating and totally counterintuitive is that when they did the same study and they had the story, but they added statistics to it, the data actually made it less likely that people would give. And the reason is because once you combine the statistics and the data, it obfuscated the moving parts of the story. So one of the things that we talk about all the time when we're coaching people is you want to tell stories because that's how people can connect in with what you are saying. That's how you get your message heard, and that's how you get people motivated to act. Okay.
Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry, Rudy. I was just going to say, in addition to my points about just how you connect with people, when Val and I, when we're doing coaching with people, we want to focus on what they know and what they do, but we also want to focus on how they make the audience feel. So Val's going to sing an aria now that will give you an idea of how stories can be transmitted through music.
Sure. So it's an age-old story. The beauty about being human is that all of our experiences are so similar. So many hundreds of years ago, Dante wrote in his Inferno a famous story that was then taken several hundred years later by Puccini and put into a little opera called Gianni Schicchi. And the story is about a teenage girl and a boy. And if you've had any teenagers in your life, there's drama. And so imagine this young girl, Lauretta, is saying to her father, "Oh, Daddy, I want to marry this young man, and please let me go and buy the ring so that I can marry him. And if you don't let me go, I'm going to throw myself into the Arno River off of the Vecchio Bridge and die. Please, 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 Daddy. Oh, mio bambino caro."
Oh mio bambino caro, mi piacerebbe in porto rossa a l'anello. Sì, sì, ci voglio andare. E se l'ama s'intorno ma per buttarmi in arno
Let's have a round of applause for Valerie on that one. Opinion-based rhetoric is often polarizing. If you need to make an argument, tell a story instead, especially one you feel strongly about. Like music, storytelling takes practice. It's a skill. To become a storyteller, you must first know your message, find the right example, and as I said before, weave it into your narrative, convey it with passion, and support it with facts. So for example, you can say, not all Muslims are bad. Or you can tell the story of Mohammed Salman Hamdani, a paramedic who perished in 9/11 while trying to rescue those trapped in Twin Towers, and describe how unfortunate it is to tarnish Hamdani's sacrifice by calling to attention his Islamic faith. Which is more powerful? I think it's obvious.
Okay, so now we're going to see how these 6 elements that we've been talking about, these 6 elements of persuasion, how they fit in by looking at a real screenplay by master screenwriter Aaron Sorkin from the movie A Few Good Men. We're going to play the scene. This is Tom Cruise's opening statement. And then I'm going to walk you through some of the language, and you'll see how the elements that we've been talking about show up in Sorkin's screenplay. Let's watch the film.
Lookout Cafe.
There was no poison on the rag, and there was no intent to kill, and any attempt to prove otherwise is futile because it just ain't true. When Dawson and Downey went into Santiago's room that night, it wasn't because of vengeance or hatred. It wasn't to kill or harm. And it wasn't because they were looking for kicks on a Friday night. It's because it was what they were ordered to do. Let me say that again. It's because it was what they were ordered to do. Now, out in the real world, that means...
The sound is off, Steve.
He starts by saying there was no poison on the rag and there was no intent to kill, and any attempt to prove otherwise is futile because it just ain't true. Here's what he used there. He's compelling physicality. He's standing up. There's a strong declarative statement. He's compelling in that he's folksy because it just ain't true. And then there's a pause again, and he stands up. Now we go to the next section. When Dawson and Downey went into Santiago's room, hey, you know, I never thought I was playing Tom Cruise. People say I look like Tom Cruise. No, that's actually... When Dawson and Downey went into Santiago's room that night, it wasn't because of hatred or vengeance. It wasn't to kill or harm, and it wasn't because they were looking for kicks on a Friday night. It's because it's what they were ordered to do. Let me say that again. It's because it's what they were ordered to do. There's the contrast, there's repetition, and again, there's a pause. So now he goes to, now out in the real world, that means nothing. And here in the Washington Navy Yard, it doesn't mean a whole lot more. But if you're a Marine assigned to Rifle Company Windward, Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, when you're given an order, you follow it or you pack your bags. Make no mistake about it, Harold Dawson and Loudon Downey are sitting before you today because, here's the pause again, they did their job. It's compelling, there's repetition. You can see all of the elements that exist in this Aaron Sorkin screenplay. So now, Rudy, I'm going to turn it over to you for questions and answers, some that you'll answer and some that you'll send over to Val and me.
So, Steve, the question I have for you is, as a young lawyer, my old law partner said, by the way, you have to know when to shut up and when to listen. Do you find that people have an innate problem with listening, and that's really the skill that they need to learn the most?
Yeah, I clearly think people tend to listen to the words, but they don't listen to the meaning behind the words. That's a big problem that I see. And a lot of times what's being conveyed is not being conveyed by the words or even the physicality. You can get an energy, I think, Rudy, from people where it's hard to define what it is, but you get a sense, for example, do I trust this person? Are they credible? Do they have my best interest at heart? So I think there's a number of things, but listening without assumptions is one of the things that I find I end up coaching people quite a bit about, because people can make all sorts of assumptions and oftentimes they're not right. I always tell people, more questions, better questions. That's my mantra.
Val, would you like to add something to that?
Sure. I mean, I agree with Steve. It's in general, the communication 101 that in order to effectively communicate, you really have to listen to what the other person is saying, not just formulating what you want to say, right? So it really is give and taking in ebbing and flowing. And I love what your mentor, your professor said to you, Rudy, because it really is listening more and speaking less. And also, it's like my mother said to me, God gave me 2 eyes and 2 ears and just 1 mouth for a reason. So I should be looking and listening twice as much as I'm speaking.
Every semester, I teach an international law class at WashU. And the first question I ask them is, can you tell me what color this cup is? Inevitably, I get white. And I say to them, that's not my question. My question is, can you tell me what color the cup is? The answer is yes. My follow-up question is, what color is a cup? It's a very simple example, but it really, that example resonates with people like, wow, I really have to listen. Oftentimes, when you talk about people eating breakfast, lunch, and dinner, not anyone thinks they can run a restaurant, for example, or manage a restaurant. But when it comes to speaking, people say, I already know how to talk. I'm very well prepared. So Steve and Val, do you find that people tend to be somewhat very overconfident about their ability to communicate? And then when you listen to them, you think, oh my God, what did he say? What did she say?
Yes, yes. And, one of the things that, if you're somebody like me, for example, that speaks quite a bit, one of the areas that I have to be careful of is not being overconfident, that I can just show up and the words will come. And one of the things that we have definitely found doing this program, because there's so many moving parts and behind the scenes, there's just an enormous amount of technical challenges that we've been wrestling with. Because of that, coordinating it, I've had to really script these words out more than I would normally do. It's not scripted per se, but I had to be more careful about the construction of the language. And frankly, what I found is that it's made it easier to actually get the message across. So most people, I think, if you think about actors and you think about athletes, they are preparing and practicing all the time, people in the military. Whereas I have found that many people in business, whether it's professional services, lawyers, investment advisors, whoever, many of them don't use the same deliberate practice principles to prepare for a performance. And I think that's a mistake.
It's also ironic because we often say, I believe you all say that you are actually practicing the law. And so that when you are, whether in a corporate boardroom, whether you are analyzing contracts and negotiations or in front of a jury, there really is the element of practice to it. And so part of that practice, to Steve's point, is really getting down what you want to say so that you are prepared to listen. I've found that if I don't really know my subject, if I'm singing an aria, for example, and I don't know all of the lyrics, the libretto, that is maddening because I can't even hear the music because I'm trying to run the lyrics in my head before I even open my mouth. And that doesn't allow for a better synergistic. Sometimes someone skips a beat and I might have missed it because I'm so focused on what I was going to say and not listening.
Yeah, one of the things actually, Val and I met many, many years ago. She was an investment advisor. Mm-hmm. I was the national director of wealth planning. We were both working for a large bank wealth management firm. And we would talk about how we'd go on client meetings and many times people would have discussions about who was going to say what or how we were going to approach the meeting. And it was, driving in the car, maybe with the radio playing or something. Yeah. And, we would go through all this trouble to try and get in front of prospective clients. And then it was time to actually present to them. It was sometimes mediocre at best.
At best.
Yeah, at best.
Have you
What else you got for us, Rudy?
We have a question. Another question says, have you been able to deploy sticks on paper, i.e. an email communication?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Yeah, the truth of the matter is, I think about it. I tend not to actually, I don't think I'm coaching as much about that as I probably should. But one of the things, for example, that I think when I'm writing that I try and do more than anything is try to be clear with the message and get the message up front. We've all had emails, and I've written plenty of them, where it takes a while to get through the sequence to find out what the person is actually writing about. So I like to put, and I advise people when they're writing, put your message, your clear message or your ask up front, and then describe after that. So people have some context when they're reading the message.
Yeah, I agreed. I think it's the old adage of tell them what you're going to tell them, or tell them what you're going to say it, and then tell them what you told them. And to Steve's point, another way of putting it is actually either thinking of it as an abstract, the opening being an abstract of what is the bulk of the email communication or written communication, as well as, or you could think of it as an executive summary. So in this email, you're going to read points A, B, C, and D. And what I want you to see or understand is 1, 2, 3, and then give them the details. I found that is particularly effective, particularly when it's a long email. I know I'm writing to someone who's very busy and who may actually miss the details if I embed my ask in the middle of the communication or even at the bottom. They may never see it. So I want to put it up front and even sometimes tell a story in a very succinct manner.
Yeah. So I think structuring your emails or written communication is really important.
Somebody said in concerning my example, if anybody answered my questions that literally, I would want to murder them.
Wow.
And I would imagine, and you know what, the person who asked that question, I agree with you to a point. I use that as an example to one extreme, that it's very important that you listen. It's very important that you wait before, when that person's finished talking, before you actually start responding to what they're saying. Too often, and I've had clients that did this, that they can't complete a sentence. They go on to the next thought before they go on to the next sentence. And too often, as you were saying, Val, people are talking and you're so worried about what you're going to say in response that you don't listen to what they're saying. And they may even agree with you. Something that we didn't talk about in the overall presentation is anger. Now, we talked about weaving the story. We talked about getting the message across. My personal philosophy is that should never be done when you're angry, when you're upset. You need to calm down, because you're never going to be able to tell an effective story if you're angry or if you're worked up.
Yeah, it's so much about kind of what I think I alluded to earlier, which is, people can kind of get a feeling of who you are being when you're communicating with them. And if you are angry or any other attribute that you don't want to convey to the other party, you need to find a way to take some time to where you're in a better state to actually deliver a message.
I agree with that. And this kind of goes with improvisation too, because you may be triggered in the moment and find that by surprise that you're angry. And so you may want to practice some self-care to help yourself diffuse yourself in the moment. So practicing outside of the moment, it could be as simple as taking a very pregnant breath or deeply inhaling and holding it for a count of 4. So inhaling on 4 in your mind, like, and holding it for 4 beats, and then exhaling. That may be enough to calm you down. It also is my experience that that kind of reaction sometimes can be off-putting to the other person who may be trying to push your buttons, particularly in negotiations or in a very contentious kind of situation.
We have an interesting comment from one of our audience members, and that is that some people listen to respond and not to understand.
Yes.
That's a great point.
Wasn't it Stephen Covey that said, "Seek first to understand"?
Yes.
Something
I think
like
so.
that.
Yeah.
So I think that's true. And look, in today's world, it has never been more important to try to seek to understand. I mean, it is such a polarized environment in so many ways that, to the extent that any of us can listen better, and as I said, listen without assumptions, then it's going to be better for everyone.
I agree. And I think in order to respond, one has to be able to understand, right? And so if we are seeking to respond versus understanding first, if we swap them and go for my response first versus my understanding first, I've found, particularly my own self, that if I had just waited a little bit, as Rudy alluded to earlier, and actually perhaps ask clarifying questions, then perhaps my response would have been more spot on. My response would have been better received. My response would have been more accurate, as opposed to, I heard someone say something and then I'm going to respond. Sometimes it's also been my experience, particularly when I'm working with people whose English is not their first language. If I'm overseas and I'm working in a different context, if I'm in a different culture, I've found that by asking clarifying questions or even paraphrasing what I heard, that can often lead to greater understanding and greater appreciation in the conversation and in the negotiation.
Yeah, absolutely.
And another question we have along those lines is, do you have any exercises that help refine the presentation techniques we've discussed today?
Oh, in terms of exercises,
Things
You know,
people can do, yeah.
yeah, one of the things that really made an impact on me, there's a book which I strongly recommend called Made to Stick. It's by Chip and Dan Heath. They've written 4 or 5 bestsellers. I read everything that they write, and they have this idea. This is kind of where the idea of the STICKS acronyms comes from, to make it stick. They have an acronym similar to that, and it's kind of a checklist.
Mm-hmm.
And ironically, you might think that your creativity would be impeded by having a checklist. But in fact, if you have that checklist, and you can use checklists for all sorts of things, and a lot of people are starting to do that. But to me, if I'm making a presentation, if nothing else, I would take, for example, whether it's the checklist that you come from Made to Stick, or you could take the checklist of taking the STICKS acronym that we just did, and literally just making sure the more of these you have, the better. Most presentations don't have things like surprise and delight, unexpectedness. They don't have emotions. They don't have stories. And so if you look at those, and the authors of Made to Stick do this, if you look at those examples where a message has really stuck with people, then you'll find that they have as many or all of those various checklist items.
I would also say that it can't be overstated, the power of your mind and practicing in your mind. And so I know athletes do it, musicians certainly do it, where we can actually go through whatever it is that we're going to do physically in our minds mentally. And it's there have been studies to show that the body responds, the brain responds as if you're doing it physically. So one of the things you may want to try to practice, if let's say you have a presentation or you just have a conversation, and it could be with anyone. It could be with your spouse, your significant other. It could be with a coworker, a child even. Actually play it out in your head what your responses would be. So, and a fun kind of exercise is to give them different lines. So let's see. If I'm making this up and I know is breakfast time for my daughter and she's gonna ask for Cocoa Puffs, I'm like, no, we're not gonna have Cocoa Puffs today. We're gonna have oatmeal. So I'm gonna play the scenario. Mommy, I want Cocoa Puffs. No, sweetie, we're gonna have, in my head, no, honey, we're gonna have oatmeal today. But no, I want Cocoa Puffs. And then I may say something in my head like, no, we're gonna have oatmeal. And then in my mind, I could imagine her saying something outrageous like, well, may I have a horsey for breakfast? And then my response could be, well, no, we're gonna have oatmeal. And so really just playing it back and forth and just tuning my mind to be ready to respond, but also tuning my mind to what it is that I want to say and to get into the practice. And you can do that mental agility, those mental exercises with each part of the acronym.
Hey, Rudy, one practical exercise that I oftentimes use with my clients is I just simply sort of set up columns and I say, okay, here's what, let's say, a client or prospective client asked. That's one column. Here's your response. And then the third column is what could be a different and potentially better response. Mm-hmm. And just by deconstructing the language, it's much more easy to see, look, whatever it is that I did or said, there's probably something else that I might want to consider. If you don't do that, what I have found, and I've certainly found this with myself, is I tend to go back to what I am comfortable with, as opposed to literally taking it apart and seeing where I could be better. Right. By the way, if anybody wants information on these checklists or any of this information, certainly hit me up by email or however you're able to get a hold of me, and Val and I'd be happy to share some of that information that we use with clients with you.
Yes.
An interesting commentary. Somebody mentioned that's a counseling technique to say to someone. So what I hear you saying is, and they recommend the book Checklist Manifesto by Atul Gawande.
Ooh, spell that.
It's
AT.
ATUL and then GAWANDE.
It's a
Excellent.
great book, and I actually give that to clients oftentimes. It's a tremendous book because what it shows is that here you have the best trained doctors in the world, one of the examples from the book from Johns Hopkins, and you find that just using a paper and pen simple checklist dramatically cut down on surgical errors. And so these are people that have life and death in their hands, literally, and they've got malpractice to worry about,
Right.
and they're superbly trained, and yet they still found that even these folks were making mistakes. So using a checklist is a tremendous tool and probably much underutilized. That's a great example. Thanks for bringing that up,
Thank
Rudy.
you.
Well, Val mentioned something about talking with people where English is not their first language.
Mhm.
And we haven't even begun to scratch the surface on the cultural communications with people from different walks of life and different cultural areas. I recommend that when you're in a situation where people don't have English as a first language, is choose your words carefully.
Yes.
So for example, in my class, I have students, some from Somalia, Nigeria, Turkey, and I made this statement, well, we're going to set up a brick and mortar operation. Now, everyone in America knows what that means.
Mhm.
And one of my students, the one from Turkey, Professor, what does brick and mortar mean?
Yeah.
And it forced me to think back and say, okay, I really have to tone down what I'm saying and choose those words carefully. So it's important to pick the words carefully. And the other comment I wanted to make about anger, sometimes just act it out. Sometimes I will be yelling at my paralegal and I'll say, and I'm going to do this and then this, and then see what happens. And she says, are you actually going to tell that to them? No, I just need to calm down. and then I will approach more calmly. And then one other thing is athletes have a tendency to visualize. They
Yes.
picture themselves running across being first at the goal line. They picture themselves throwing the touchdown pass and then running and catching the touchdown pass at the same time. Visualization is a very, very powerful tool because it convinces your mind that something is going to happen.
Yeah,
Yes.
I absolutely agree. So
Mhm.
I know there's plenty of other questions. If anyone wants to, pose questions to Rudy, Val, or I, we're happy to take them. We have just a few minutes left. Rudy, any thoughts you want to leave the audience?
Well, we have a very, very good question here that I think might be good to close with. And that is, let me find it here. Have you seen generational communication issues as well with other attorneys or clients, especially given a generation raised on social media and not well read because they have been trained on communicating in text or reading an article of the most? Who wants
Yes.
to carry that first? Because I
Yes.
have some strong opinions on that. But Val, ladies first. Why don't we start with you and then we'll go with Steve.
Sure. And so I'll answer. And then, the answer is yes. And Steve and I have talked a lot with folks about this generational divide. And we've counseled folks on both sides. And it really is, it comes down to communicating to be understood as well as to understand. And so one of the things that we've talked about, and I've certainly talked with a number of folks, is I think we have 5 generations in the workplace right now. The first time, at least in modern history, that we've had that many generations. And so to say to folks, keep it simple, the way Rudy, you just said, but also to help people have a better understanding of how the other person may be perceiving. Sometimes you have to create stereotypes, but to give them a generalized view of perhaps I would speak to my grandmother very differently than I would speak to or communicate with my granddaughter. I don't have one, but I'm just saying, Yeah.
I don't have one either.
Well, I do. I'm old, so I have one.
Well, Rudy, you know, Shakespeare said, old people, many faint as they were dead, unwieldy, slow, and pale as lead. I'll just comment on this that, you know, my daughter just started college, one of my daughters, and she's in classes where they're dealing with gender identification and a whole bunch of other issues. And I am learning a lot about it because, you know, you just can't help kind of, like we talked about schemas and reference points. My reference points, I mean, you know, I was a big band drummer. So what are we playing? We're playing Bewitched, Bothered, and Bewildered. And, you know, my daughter, I had to tell her at one point, you know, how great Elvis Presley was, because to her, like, he was some old guy. And, you know, so that happens all the time, frankly. And we have to be more conscious of it. And what we find, I mean, I do a lot of work with investment advisors and professionals like attorneys. And I always make a point of telling them that they need to sort of think in the minds of their audience. And again, that's not easy to do, but you have to be open to it and you have to listen, which we get back to listening again.
And sometimes it helps to just ask, you know, ask someone how they want to be communicated, ask if what I've said to you either makes sense or is there a better way that I can communicate with you? And sometimes just asking the question in a respectful manner elicits such respect and can forge a bond that may take longer without the question or making assumptions.
So that actually maybe is a good lead in to how we want to close this program, because we're talking about listening and respect. And one of the things that I think we need more of, and it's a little bit cheesy to say so, but a little bit more love.
Yes.
And of course, dating myself with a Burt Bacharach song from the 60s, we're going to close with the song, What the World Needs Now is Love.
But before you do that, Steve.
Yeah, Rudy.
Let me just tell people, please, we've only got a minute or two left. Click the survey and tell us what you thought about it. So please do it. This feedback is important for us. I also want to thank Primaris, our sponsor, for putting this program together. I can tell you that this program took a lot of man hours to put together, especially by video. Saying that, Steve, please.
Okay. Well, listen, we're going to play and run off. Jason Harris has been with us on bass. Reed Bodenstein, Valerie Gay. I'm Steve Capatera.
And Rudy Rivera.
And I'm the only non-singing person in the group. I was not allowed to sing. So.
What the world needs now is love, sweet love. It's the only thing that there's just too little of. What the world needs now is love, sweet love. No, not just for some, but for everyone. We don't need another mountain. There are mountains and hillsides enough to climb. There are oceans and rivers enough to cross, enough to last till the end of time. What the world needs now is love, sweet love. It's the only thing that there's just too little of. What the world needs now is love, sweet love. No, not just for some, but for everyone. Not just for some, for everyone. The world needs love.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.